In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon His last and beloved Messenger Muhammad, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all. The title of this episode is How to Derive Scientific Laws from the Quran, from the guidance of the last revelation of Allah God to people, the Quran. So in this episode, brothers and sisters, I will show, Allah God willing, how to learn scientific laws from the Quran, the laws that govern phenomena in creation. Now, there are two ways to know the laws that govern any kind of phenomenon in creation. The first technique that people adopt is they do a lot of experiments and a lot of research to develop these laws. The way I'm going to present this episode is to learn these laws directly from the Noble Quran, without wasting time, effort and money. Now, if you ponder upon verse number 12 of chapter 17 of the Noble Quran, where Allah God Almighty states the following: Then Allah God has obliterated the sign of the night, while He has made the sign of the day illuminating, that you may seek bounty from your Lord, and that you may know the number of the years and the reckoning. And Allah God has detailed everything with full details. Now, at the end of the verse, Allah God states that He detailed everything. What does this mean? This means that nothing in creation is chaotic, that occurs without any law binding it. So every phenomenon in creation, there should be a law that governs this phenomenon. Any phenomenon in creation, anything that you can see in creation, there is a law binding it, there is a law governing its behavior. So how to learn these laws from the last revelation of Allah God to people in the Quran? Now, Allah God Almighty guided me to this technique, and it can be divided into 3 steps, and these 3 steps are completely derived from the Quran. Now let's start to learn these steps. The first step can be learned from pondering upon verse number 19 of chapter 15 of the Noble Quran, which states, And the earth Allah God has spread out, and has placed therein fair mountains, and caused to grow therein all kinds of things in balanced proportion. So Allah says that we can learn from this verse that everything in creation is balanced. Everything in creation is balanced. So with regards to engineering systems, what does balance mean? Balance means that when a system is balanced, that the sum of inputs is equal to sum of outputs. So a balanced system means that the sum of inputs to the system is equal to sum of outputs. That's a balanced system. So that's the property of a balanced system. Now that's the first step. Now let me give an example to demonstrate this point. Suppose that we have this column, and I'm subjecting this column to a compressive force. I'm putting force on its 2 ends. Now what happens, due to this force, this column will be compressed, so there will be a displacement to this column. So this is a phenomenon that when I put force on this column, it's compressed. I want to know the law that governs this phenomenon. I want to know the law that governs this phenomenon. Now the first thing that Allah God Almighty teaches me and teaches us, that this system is balanced, which means that the input, the force, and the sum of inputs should be equal to the sum of outputs, the displacements and the other outputs from the system. So the sum of inputs, force, acoustic energy, thermal energy, must be equal to the sum of outputs, displacements, sound, acoustic energy, thermal energy, etc. So that's the first thing. That's the first step in deriving any law. Now the second step, if we ponder upon verse number 7 of chapter 55 of the Noble Quran, where Allah states, And the heaven He has raised it, and He has set up the scale. So here we can learn that after Allah Almighty created the heavens, He set up the scale, and this scale is the scale of creation. So we can learn here that the scale of creation, as any scale, should have a left side and right side. So this scale has a left side and right side. Now on the left side, we should have the inputs to a system or a phenomenon, and on the right side, we have the outputs from the system or from the phenomenon. So this scale, we put on one side the inputs and on the other side the outputs. That's the second step. So in this case, we have the inputs, the force, and the output, the displacement. So you put the force on one side and displacement on the other. Now the last step, we can learn it from verse number 182 of chapter 26 of the Holy Quran, which states, and weigh with the straight balance, and weigh with the straight balance. Allah teaches us here to weigh with the straight balance. We can learn from this that this scale I just described should be balanced, should be straight. So this scale I just described should be balanced, should be straight. Now, any scale, to be straight, you put weights on one side to make it level with the other side. So any scale, you put weights on one side to straighten the scale up, to straighten it. Now we see the beauty of the teaching of the Quran. It's simple, direct, to the point, and anybody can understand it. That's another miracle of the Noble Quran, that these concepts, anybody can understand them. So again, the last step, that we put the scale, the inputs on one side, the outputs on the other, and we multiply the inputs by weights. These weights will make these the two sides of the scale balanced on the same level. Now, what are these weights? These weights, they are the variables connecting the input to the output. For example, in our column, the input is the force, the output displacement, and the weight is the stiffness of the column. The stiffness, because as the stiffness changes, the displacement of the column changes for the same amount of input force. So the weight is the thing that connects the input to the output. So in our case here, how to derive the law for this column? Firstly, we put the scale, we put the force on one side, the input force, and on the other side we put the displacement, and we multiply the inputs by this weight, which is the stiffness of the column. Now, if this weight, when it increases the output for the same amount of input, then we put it in the numerator. If this weight, as it increases, it decreases the output for the same amount of input, we put it into the denominator. Once again, if this weight, when it increases the output, then we put it in the numerator. If this weight, when it increases, it decreases the output, we put it in the denominator. So in our case, as the stiffness increases, it decreases the output for the same amount of input force. So we put the stiffness in the denominator. So the scale becomes force over stiffness is equal to displacement. So a little bit of arrangement, we come to the final law, which is the force is equal to stiffness multiplied by displacement. So we get the law that the force is equal to stiffness multiplied by displacement. So again, I just summarized the way that we learn laws from the Noble Quran. We know that every system is balanced. We put up a scale. We put on the left side the inputs, in this case the force. On the right side we put the displacement, the output of the system. We multiply the inputs by weights, the relationship between the input and the output. In our case we have stiffness. So we know that as the stiffness increases, the displacement decreases, so we put the stiffness in the denominator, so we have force over stiffness is equal to displacement, so force is equal to stiffness multiplied by displacement. This law that we derived in seconds, is called Hooke's law, the law of the spring. Now, if you think about the time and effort that Hooke took to develop this law, he took a lot of time and effort to develop this law. Here, Allah God Almighty teaches us this law in a matter of seconds. So Allah God Almighty wants the believer to be the teacher of others and not the one on the receiving end. So the years that took Hooke to develop this law, years, Allah teaches us in a matter of seconds. Another example, now this column, coming back to this column, it has a stiffness. But I also know as a phenomenon that if I change the material of this column for the same area and length, I have a different stiffness. If I change the material of the column for the same design, I have different stiffness. So I want to know the law that governs that links the structural stiffness of the column with the material used. So from the Noble Quran, I put on the right side the stiffness of the column, and on the left side I put the input, which is the stiffness of the material used. Now I multiply this stiffness of the material used by the weights. Now the first weight is the area of the column. As I increase the area, the stiffness of the column increases. When I put a larger area for the column, the stiffness, the resistance of the column increases. So I put the area in the numerator. Now the length of the column, that's one weight. The other weight is the length of the column. As I increase the length of the column, the stiffness decreases. If I have a longer column, it will deflect more, so it has a lower stiffness. So as the length increases, the stiffness decreases. So I put the length in the denominator. So we have in the denominator, we have length of the column. So the law becomes that the stiffness is equal to the stiffness of the material multiplied by area over length. So the structural stiffness, the stiffness of the structure is equal to the stiffness of the material multiplied by the area over the length. So we have this, and this is a very famous law in structural mechanics. We developed it from the Quran in a matter of seconds. Another example in electrical engineering. For example, if I have a conductive material, conductive for electricity, and I put a voltage on this side and another voltage on the other side, so I have a difference in voltage between the two sides, I find that a current passes through the material. If I put different voltages on its ends, I find a current passing through it. So this is a phenomenon. I want to know the law that governs this phenomena. How can I know this? From the Noble Quran, I put the scale. On the right side, I put the outputs, which is the current. And on the left side, I put the input, which is the difference in voltage, the delta V. Difference in voltage, delta V. Now, I multiply the input by the weights. The thing that if I change the outputs for the same amount of input. The resistance, the weight here is the resistance of the material. As the resistance increases, the current decreases. So I put the resistance in the denominator. So the law becomes that delta V over the resistance is equal to the current. So it becomes that the difference in voltage is equal to resistance multiplied by current. And this law is a very famous law in electrical engineering. It's called Ohm's law. Ohm's law. Now, again, Ohm, this scholar, he took a lot of years developing this law. Allah, God Almighty, teaches us this law in a matter of seconds. Another example, the same material, I want to find a relationship between the resistance of this wire and the material used. I know that if I change the material, the resistance changes. So I want to know the law. From the Noble Quran, on the right side, I put the outputs. In this case, is the resistance of the wire. And on the left side, I put the input, which is the resistance of the material used. I multiply the inputs by the weights. The first thing is the area. As I increase the area of the wire, the resistance decreases. When I increase the area of the wire, the resistance decreases. So I put the area in the denominator. So it becomes, the law becomes that the resistance of the material over the area is equal to the resistance of the wire. Now another weight, which is the length of the wire. As I increase the length of the wire, the resistance increases. So I put the length in the numerator. So the law becomes that the resistance of the wire is equal to the resistance of the material multiplied by the length over the area. And this is a famous law in electrical engineering as well, developed from the Quran in a matter of seconds. The last example, if I have this material again, and I put temperature difference on its ends. Here we have T1, here we have T2, a difference in temperature. I find that heat flows within the material. I find that there is a flow of heat within the material. I want to know the law that governs this phenomenon. From the Noble Quran, on the right side, I put the outputs, which in this case the heat, and the inputs delta T, difference in temperature. I multiply the inputs by the weights, the relationship between the input and the output. The first weight is the material used, the conductivity of the material used. As the conductivity of the material increases, the amount of heat flowing through the material increases. So I put it in the numerator. So the law becomes that the conductivity multiplied by delta T is equal to the heat. Another weight is the area of the material. As the area increases, the amount of heat flowing increases. As the area increases, the amount of heat flowing through the material increases. So it's the numerator as well. The last weight is the thickness or the length of the material. As the length or the thickness increases, the amount of heat flowing decreases. So it's in the denumerator. So the law becomes that the heat is equal to the conductivity multiplied by area multiplied by delta T over thickness of the material. And that's a very famous law. It's called Fourier's law for heat conduction. Fourier's law of heat conduction. Fourier, this scholar, took a lot of time developing this law. Here we developed it from the Quran in a few seconds. So brothers and sisters, I showed a way from the Noble Quran how to derive and learn scientific and engineering laws from the Quran. And we see that Allah Almighty shows us this, such that the believer will be the teacher of others, and the non-believers and non-Muslims would be attracted to the Quran, and that will be a way for them to be guided to the path of Allah God Almighty, which will bring them happiness in this life and the hereafter. And to know more details about this topic, please visit my website at www.quran-miracle.com, and you can email me at zaidquran@yahoo.com, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all.